Hi everyone, and welcome back for population limiting factors. First, let's look at all of the aspects of life, from the very smallest, the individual, up to the very largest, the biosphere. So here you have an individual member of a species. Let's say it's goldfish. Our population is going to be a collection of goldfish, or one particular species in a given area. A community is going to be that population of goldfish along with all of the other populations that are there, say jellyfish or, sharks and seagrass and crabs. When we get to ecosystem, then we simply have abiotic factors that are put in there. Well, that community, what rocks are there? What water is there? What sun or air are there? Then when we go up to a biome, essentially a biome is just a bigger ecosystem. So you might say an ecosystem is, a bay. Well, that bay opens out onto the saltwater biome. And then the biosphere is everything from the edge of the atmosphere all the way down maybe to bedrock to where the living things stop. The reason I did that previous slide is so that when we use things like species, we mean, usually a single individual. And when we talk about a population, we're talking about all of that group in a given area. So let's say that we have 2 mice. 2 mice will have 56 pups or baby mice each year. And potentially those baby mice, each baby mouse, could go on to have 56 of its own. Hopefully you can imagine how quickly that population would get completely out of control. We'd just be covered in mice. But obviously we're not. So what stops exponential growth from occurring? These are called limiting factors. A limiting factor is a biotic or abiotic factor that restricts the number of individuals in a population. I want you to think for a moment all the ways that mice can die, all the ways that those 56 baby mice don't all grow up to find mates and all grow up to have 56 young, which all grow up and grow up and grow up. Limiting factors. Here are some good examples. Competitors, disease and parasites, weather and fire, available habitat, and predators. We're going to take them one at a time. Competitors result when an organism is competing with something else in the same area for the same resources. So for example, here are 2 birds of prey. These 2 birds of prey both want to eat the same thing. Those little mice from a few screens back. They also want to nest in trees, and so they are competing for their young to have the mice to eat, the trees to nest in, the air to fly in. And so because both of these guys live in Pennsylvania and they're both feeding on the same mice species, and they're both competing for the same trees, these 2 birds of prey are keeping the bird of prey population in check, as well as in a little bit, we're going to see how they're keeping the mice population in check. Disease and parasites. Not every member of of a species is supposed to grow up and produce offspring. Sometimes they're randomly selected for this not to happen. They're in the wild, they come across a group of ticks, the ticks latch on, and ticks can actually suck so much blood that they can kill an organism. Or perhaps they go to drink water, they drink dirty water, they get a worm parasite. That worm parasite feeds on the food they're feeding on. They're smaller, they're weaker than their competition. Mates don't pick them, they eventually die. So disease and parasites are a very good way for populations to be limited. Weather. I'm going to lump weather along with fires. So weather is your storms and your droughts and you're flooding, and maybe it's too hot or it's too cold, and fire can come through, and because of certain weather patterns, and you can end up with a beautiful living ecosystem that very quickly over time becomes less hospitable. Thus, less organisms are capable of living there. If we look at the picture on the right, you can see all of the carcasses of these dead animals, and no wonder why. Maybe this used to be a grassland, but what you're looking at here is called desertification. And what it means is that over years, there's been less water in this ecosystem. And as there's been less water, the grass species have given way to more drought-tolerant species. But unfortunately, there's a whole lot less of them. And so these animals can't find enough to eat. They can't find enough to drink. They can't find a tree to stand under to get away from the sun, and they die. Available habitat. You can see that my koala no longer has trees to be living in. He only eats eucalyptus, and so if there are not eucalyptus trees, if those have been logged to make way for roads or homes or farms, then he doesn't have anywhere to go. He needs to walk all the way over there, and there's probably a koala that's already living in that habitat. So now maybe he has to fight that koala to get his own tree, to get his own group of trees. So that's what happens with available habitat. If it is limited for any reason, then all of a sudden the animals that are living there no longer have a place to go. This is often human created, but it can happen for other reasons. Think back to my last slide. What if a forest fire starts? What if it comes through and burns that area? What if there's a landslide? What if there's a volcanic eruption? Available habitat can be changed naturally, or it can be changed by human development. Predators. The better the predators are doing, the worse the prey is doing. But don't worry. These guys tend to change in a predictable pattern with one another. We'll look at predator-prey relationships a little bit later, but they're definitely a limiting factor. The more lions there are, the less gazelles. The more gazelles, the more room there is for the lion's population to rise. Carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals of a species that an ecosystem can support. This differs drastically depending on the health of that ecosystem. So in other words, you can look at my elk who's standing in a field. If he's standing in a beautiful field like that, where there's a lot of mixed grasses, thus he can hide, he can eat, probably right behind him there will be a forest where he can run into to find different food sources. That's a really healthy ecosystem where he can find a mate and breed and raise up those young. Now imagine if this is a farmer's field where there's only a monoculture. There's maybe, instead of the grass that he loves to eat, what if it was soybeans? Something that he wouldn't find very palatable, something that isn't a natural food source for him. Well, then the carrying capacity of the elk population is going to be a lot lower than in a more natural environment that you can see here. Visualizing carrying capacity. The bucket is the carrying capacity. All of the stuff that's coming out of the bucket are the limiting factors. So annual production, that's our birth rate. The birth rate is coming in. If the bucket is already full, those individuals that are going into the bucket are going to need to exit the ecosystem in one way or another. Some of them are going to starve. Some of them are going to have accidents. Some of them are going to get polluted. Some of them are going to die of old age. Some are going to, catch a disease or have a parasite. Some of them are going to get eaten by other populations. And then I wish that there was one over here that had like a little out arrow. Some of them are going to emigrate to other environments if that's possible. And then down here you have your population losses or your death rate. So hopefully you can kind of see how all of this stuff plays back into the last unit. Your birth rate, what is limiting that birth rate, where that death rate is coming from. Let's look at carrying capacity on a graph. You can see that the carrying capacity is an undulating line like this. And that this line here is basically the idea is for it to kind of go through the middle of the undulations. And so the black line is the population at a specific time. And the dotted line, of course, is your carrying capacity. So in other words, let's just pretend that there were actual years down here. If you went to say, oh, look, this is 2006. Oh, there's 2007. There's 2008. So you can see how at any given time at the same month, what is that population looking like? Like every December or every May, where is the actual population? And then where is that actual population in relationship to the carrying capacity? Is it above it? Is it below it? Is it dead on? When a population is below carrying capacity, it will naturally increase. In other words, the birth rates will exceed the death rates because all of those things that you saw in the bucket previously, the predation and the accidents and all of those things, they're going to be happening less because that population has room to grow. There is more space in the environment than the organism is currently taking up. But if it increases too much and rises above its carrying capacity, it will then naturally start to decrease in size. Those limiting factors will begin to press on that species, and the death rate will begin to exceed the birth rate. When a population is below its carrying capacity, it will increase with size. In other words, the birth rate will exceed the death rate. This happens over and over, but the increases and decreases get smaller and smaller. So generally speaking, when a population starts, they will shoot way over carrying capacity because they're moving into that environment or something has happened to make that environment for a moment really, really good for that organism. So they breed and they breed out of control and they get really, really high. But then the natural environmental pressures or the limiting factors begin to squeeze them down. And because probably that, say, boom in rabbits has led to another population getting really big, that other population, say foxes, crush the rabbits down below carrying capacity. And then the cycle repeats itself. But because the environment isn't quite as good as it was the first time the boom happened, the boom happens a little bit less. The environmental pressures happen a little bit sooner, and the population begins to undulate until eventually it flattens out, and it will never quite do what this graph shows. It will always undulate a little bit or change a little bit until something happens where the environmental factors change in the positive, you get another boom, or in the negative, you get a really big crash. Now, again, just like I said, this will happen until it becomes reasonably stable, and that's this portion here at the back end of the graph. Birth rate is reasonably equal to death rate. There's a word bank at the bottom. I'm going to be quiet for a moment, or you could pause the video if you think you need more time. You should be able to fill in this graph using these words. If you haven't finished, pause the video, but I'm going to start filling in the words now. Hopefully you know we start with carrying capacity. And then carrying capacity is going to be determined by limiting factors. That's what we did today. What are examples of limiting factors? Food, water, space. So carrying capacity is determined by limiting factors. How much food, water, and space does a particular population have? Carrying capacity. When it's above it, the population decreases. Carrying capacity. When it's below it, the population increases. Now, the carrying capacity that we've been talking about is really more for animals. There is such a thing that's called cultural carrying capacity, and that generally refers to humans. Why? Because humans don't just want to survive, they don't just want to eke out a living. They want to have a good standard of life. They want to be healthy and happy and fulfilled. And so that's where this term cultural carrying capacity comes in. It is always less than the actual carrying capacity for an area. Why? Because think about standards of living. I want you to think about things in your life that you would not be willing to give up. What kind of housing? What kind of food? What kind of safety? Obviously, these values change depending on the culture and depending on what that area of the world can support. Here is, again, one more graph. I know it's in deer, but let's say that we don't want there to be as many deer as there can be. We want there to be deer that are living a good and healthy life. We don't want to see deer struggling around, starving. We don't want to see them getting hit by the dozens in the road. We want them to have a good habitat, have strong offspring, have enough to feed those offspring, have a place to live where they're safe and can raise that offspring. So cultural carrying capacity can be carried into animals. We just most often talk about it with humans. So here's your population curve, right? Like this. Biological carrying capacity would say that we can have about 150,000 deer. Cultural carrying capacity says that we can have maybe 75,000 deer. If you have deer up around this level, this means that they will eat everything. This means they will come into your personal yard. They will eat your hostas. They will eat your euonymus bushes. They will eat, your daisies. They will knock down fences to get into your garden. They will jump 10-foot fences because they're desperate. They need to feed themselves. They need to feed their young. Okay, during the rut, you're going to see a lot more deer fighting, a lot more deer interactions. Why? Because there's not territory for those male deer when they're up here at this really high biological carrying capacity. Why? Because your house is there, and the mall is there, and the parking lot is there, and your mom and dad's business is there. All of that sort of stuff is taking up space. So even though technically those deer could be living in your backyard and living, in right next to the parking lot in Walmart, is that really a good life for them? Or do we want to cull the deer back to a more culturally good carrying capacity? Because remember, this biological carrying capacity would have been lower, naturally speaking, when there were bears and when there were mountain lions and when there were bobcats much more prevalently in this area. And so that biological carrying capacity is unnaturally high because these population limiting factors have disappeared out of our environment. Factors that limit population growth. There are two classes of them. There are density-dependent factors, i.e. population matters, and there are density-independent factors, i.e. population is not a factor. So let's give some examples of those. Population matters. This is predation, disease, competition, territoriality, waste accumulation, and physiological factors. These are going to affect K-related species more. Why? Because remember, let's just say that we have our elephant pack, and they've just had a baby born. And really, unfortunately, a pack of hyenas comes and it kills that elephant. Well, that mother has potentially spent, more than a year gestating that elephant. She spent a whole lot of natural resources raising that elephant up in utero. That elephant has now been born, and potentially she can't get pregnant for another year after that. Because that young has been killed. She basically lost 2 years of breeding life. Those hyenas breed much more quickly, sometimes 2 times a year, depending on the species. And so these high K species, when they're predated upon, lose a lot more time and energy and resources. Again, if let's just say a disease sweeps through the same pachyderm pack and a teenager dies to disease, now you've lost even more time and effort, especially if that elephant has not yet reached its full first breeding cycle. Now, density independent factors. These are natural disasters, fire, flood, and weather. And they affect our related species more because typically those species are less mobile. Elephants are smart. They will smell fire. They will know what to do. That grandma elephant will remember the last time the fire came through. She will be able to predict where the best places are to go, and she will lead that pack to a safe spot. If you are a mouse or a caterpillar or, even a bird, you may or may not be able to fly, walk, or crawl your way to safety. Factors that feed into carrying capacity. Traits that affect an organism's schedule of reproduction and survival. There are three basic ones. How soon do you reach the age of sexual maturity? For R-related species, that's usually very young. For K-related species, it's higher. So that feeds into how many and how fast these species can come back and repopulate the ecosystem. How often organisms reproduce. So when do they reproduce, and then how many times annually, or even not annually, biannually potentially, can they reproduce? What number of offspring do they produce per event? Think about our K species. Think about our whales, our humans, our dolphins, our monkeys. A lot of times they're only going to have one offspring. Then think about our highly R-related species. Think about, worms that can have 10,000, 100,000 offspring in a single egg-laying session. Remember, these traits are evolutionary outcomes, not a conscious decision by the organism. They have grown up in an environment, and whatever their way for these three to happen in their species is what has historically been the most successful in that area for that particular species. All right, we are going to start to talk about ecological and carbon footprint, but not until we've done your lab. So I hope that you've enjoyed how populations grow and how populations are limited.